Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Irish Academy of Management Early Career Development Network event on writing and publishing literature reviews. And we're delighted this morning to be joined by Professor Dermot Breslin. I am Claire Gubbins. I'm a professor in Organisation Behaviour and Human Resource Management at Dublin City University Business School, and I'm the chair of the ECDN, the Early Career Development Network. And I'm joined this morning by other members of our group. We've got James Duggan, UCC, Jonathan Lavelle, University of Limerick, Maeve O'Sullivan, University of Galway, and two other colleagues on the ECDN committee, Donal O'Brien and Anne Keegan, who couldn't join us this morning, but this is our committee. We are an arm of the Irish Academy of Management, a strategic pillar which supports PhD students, early career academics, and early career researchers. Our logo, which you can see here on the screen, is FASTER. It took us a little bit of time to come up with that, but ultimately, as you can see, it represents the variety and the breadth of activity that's required in an academic profession, funding academic service, teaching, impact, and research. And ultimately, in simple terms, the objective of the Early Career Development Network is to support PhDs, early career researchers and academics to achieve their academic goals faster. Our activities recognize that the academic profession is very varied and very vast. And I'm sure many of you are often asked, what does an academic do? What do lecturers do? And it's best represented in this image here. So as far as possible, the activities and the initiatives that we run look to support learning and development in these areas. And we rotate across teaching, research, impact, service, and funding in terms of what we roll out. Specifically, the objectives of the Early Career Development Network are these: provide a range of professional and career development activities across the key strands of academic roles faster, to encourage collaborative debate and learning on early academic career research, teaching, and professional development, to attract and build a community of scholars and practitioners. And we have a LinkedIn page for PhDs and early career academics and researchers, which I'll invite you to join at the end of this morning's session. So we have established quite a network of scholars who can now engage with each other. Another objective is to build the capacity, skills, and networks of IAM members, particularly early career academics and researchers. And we establish a forum for discussion and debate on academic careers in an Irish and international context. So that's who we are. That's who's hosting this event. So as I said, at the end of today's session, we would love those of you who are PhDs, early career academics, to look to join us and to check out the rest of the events that we run and the activities that we run, which I'll explain later on. This morning's session, I'm going to be very pleased to introduce you to Professor Dermot Breslin, who's going to deliver the session on writing and publishing literature reviews. Once he has finished his piece, we will host a Q&A session, which will be facilitated by Dr. James Duggan. And please raise your hand and speak up with any questions that you have, or feel free to use the chat function to ask any questions that you have. And then after that, I will let you know about future events that we are holding, ask you for some feedback about today's event, and share with you the QR code so that you can join our network. I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Dermot Breslin. Clearly his bio and the nature of this talk attracted great interest. The registration numbers are off the chart. So Dermot, thank you very much for giving us your time and your expertise for this event, and especially for your support for the IAM Early Career Development Network. Dermot, as many of you have read, is the Mary McAleese Chair in Connected Leadership at Queen's Business School in Belfast. He's also the Dean of the British Academy of Management Peer Review College. He is the special issue and reviews editor at Human Resource Management Journal, and he was previously the co-editor in chief of International Journal of Management Reviews. He is extensively published himself with great expertise in writing literature reviews in particular. So without a doubt, he's best placed both personally and professionally to help us better understand how to write and publish literature reviews, having seen and lived it all himself. So Dermot, thank you again very much for joining us today. And I'm going to hand over to you if that's okay.
Thanks very much, Claire, and thank you to the Irish Academy today for the invitation to run this webinar, and to the ECDN for the invitation. So fantastic. So over the next 50 minutes or an hour or so, I'm just going to run through some ideas about literature reviews, and in particular, the thing that I'd like to present is how you develop theory from literature reviews. So how, for example, when we're reviewing a body of literature, reading papers or whatever, how we generate theory, and what that theory looks like, and then the different types of reviews and the pathways, different types of review method and the pathways that you might follow in order to develop theory. So I'm not going to present vast amounts of information on how to do different types of review methods. I'm going to really focus on the point of developing theory, new ideas, new theoretical ideas from literature reviews. So there's lots been written on literature reviews over the years, usually by journal editors who handle literature reviews. Journals like the Journal of Management, Academy of Management, Annals, JMS, IJMR as well, and the Journal of Business Research. And they have different takes on what a literature review should be doing in terms of its purpose. So, for example, if you think about the Journal of Business Research, Schneider had an editorial where she talked about very much how reviews needed to be systematic. They need to identify a particular gap, and they need to present the evidence of empirical research, scholarship that's been done within a particular area, with the view that the methodology of the review should be such that it can be replicable, so that anyone else can follow the same process and get the same review at the end. Then we have, the Academy of Management Annals that talk about a much larger view and perspective on what literature reviews are. They talk about how reviews can be, very broad reviews, looking at topics that are emergent, where, for example, the review can help to, set the direction of research within a particular area. They also talk about more narrow reviews on more mature topics that, again, can not only set new directions, but can actually lead to a rethink in terms of how the theories develop within that area. And then we have the Journal of Management, and this is a really nice quote from Cropenzano. He's talking about meta-analysis, but this could apply to any review. And the key question you need to ask yourself when you're writing a review is, if someone else had read the same papers that you have read, what have they learnt from your review that's different from what they have already gained from reading the papers? So this kind of points to the idea that a review paper goes beyond synthesis. It goes beyond summarizing what's in the literature, and it actually puts forward some type of new perspective, new insight into that literature. And this seems to be a view that's shared across all the journals, and across especially those journals that look for scholars to develop conceptual contribution or theory contribution from the review. So there was a special issue on literature reviews and organizational research methods a few years ago. And the editorial for that, it's quite an interesting editorial, where they show that there's been an explosion in the publication of literature reviews over the last, 5 or 6 years. A lot of this has been driven by the increase in publications in general. There are more journals now, more people publishing in those journals. and journals are increasing the number of papers that they're publishing. So as a result of that, there's been an explosion in the amount of research in business and management. And you would argue that there's a need for literature reviews to make sense of all that. And this is definitely reflected in what we see. But with this increasing number of reviews being published, there's a need that, it's become more competitive to get your review published. And most journals now are moving towards reviews not just being a synthesis of what knowledge is out there, but actually, developing some sort of new interpretation, some sort of theory contribution. And if we look at, that editorial that Sven Kunich and colleagues have written, they put forward a number of types of reviews, reviews that do different things like problematize and classify and organize and represent and configure. So the purpose of the review can be quite different and unique, but all of these reviews are doing something new. They're producing something that's new. If you In that same special issue, there was a paper by Simsek and colleagues, um, and Simsek again identified different types of goals that a review might have. For example, the review might seek to describe literature within an area, or to explore new themes within a literature, to evaluate it, to integrate across themes, or to explain specific phenomena or specific effects. So again, you can see that the review purpose can be quite unique, quite specific, but equally each of those has the opportunity to develop something new to theory, which can advance research in an area. And in fact, in this special issue, the guest editors, they argue that this move towards theory development, calls for a new definition of what literature reviews are. They call it reviews research. So they argue that actually literature reviews are a fundamental part of research and actually a fundamental vehicle in which theory and knowledge are developed within a particular domain. So why do we need systematic reviews? Well, there's the history of literature reviews. If you think about business and management publications over the last 50 years, literature reviews were a very strong part of this, in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. But those reviews tended to be narrative reviews that we'll talk about in a few minutes' time. So narrative reviews are usually quite a senior scholar looks at the literature or the development of research within a particular area and interprets and summarizes the developments within that field. So the interpretation can be quite specific to the researcher at hand. And in fact, the presentation of the literature is usually, clouded or colored by the theoretical background or the theoretical perspectives of that particular researcher. So some people argued that these reviews were biased as a result. They lacked a critical element because they were presenting the literature from one perspective. And most importantly, that they lacked a systematicity. So systematicity is the rigor, the transparency, and the reproducibility of the review. So drawing from advances in medical science, so in medical science is where the systematic review really took hold. And in that field, it was viewed as a method whereby you could, take stock of all the empirical evidence that had happened within a particular area. So let's say, for example, a medical researcher was looking for a specific disease or a specific phenomenon and everything that had happened within that, the systematic process would allow them to gather all the available evidence and to summarize that in a systematic way. So Tranfield and colleagues, they had decided that this would be a good approach to put forward for management to make the reviews of literature in the growing field of management science more systematic. And ultimately, this might not only benefit researchers, but eventually even benefit practitioners and policymakers, because now they could search for a review paper on a particular topic. So that topic could be, the growth of entrepreneurship or, you know, management behaviors in boards. So the systematic review would give them all the available evidence that would inform their practice or their policy. So you can see that this is the background for where the systematic review and systematic literature review as a particular method originated, over 20 years ago. And since then, it has very much grown uh, in strength and in expectations. When you try to publish a review now, the expectations are that it is systematic to some degree. So if we think about that Schneider editorial in the Journal of Business Research, uh, she argues that the systematic process should use explicit and systematic methods to review all the available evidence with the purpose of minimizing bias and producing reliable findings from which conclusions can be drawn, with a particular emphasis on minimizing the bias, increasing the rigor and transparency, and most importantly, the replicability of the findings so that if anyone follows the same process, because you're going to be transparent about the method, then anyone will come up with the same result at the end. Now, as I'll argue later, that particular element of replicability is very problematic when we're talking about theorizing from literature reviews. Uh, when we're talking about descriptive synthesis, that's one thing, but what we're talking about today is theorizing. But anyway, before I do that, we'll just go through what the process is typically outlined in terms of a systematic literature review. So the process starts where you create a review panel. This is like a team of experts or a team of people working in a particular area. They might come from different disciplines. And that panel will sit down and through a process, an iterative process, they will determine what the purpose, the scope, and the research question is. So this is quite interesting because this initial process is actually not just systematic, it's generative. It's a process whereby they experiment, they come up with new ideas, they bounce ideas off each other. And this is where really the theory development becomes integrated into the review by identifying an original gap, by identifying a particular way of approaching the literature, and by determining how they're going to analyze the papers in advance. What they're doing here is they're trying to outline how they're going to, advance the field of knowledge through this review. They may, carry out some scoping studies to help with definitions, clarifications, refinements. But ultimately, the end result here is what's known as a review protocol. And the protocol identifies the research question, the search strategy, selection, and sometimes the analysis as well. So what you're doing is you're creating, you're doing all the creative bit up front, the theory development, generative part up front, and you're coming up with this protocol that then you can split among your review team and everyone can follow it. It's transparent, it's rigorous, and the idea of having this is that you can do a review as part of a large team. So I've recently completed a large systematic review with 5 other people, and we followed the same process. We come up with research questions. We spent almost 18 months in this development of the review protocol. But once we identified what it was we were doing, we then all agreed and we went away and did it. And this is the key thing, that in a systematic literature review, this iterative part happens in advance. So once you launch the project and you all start to read the literature and analyze the literature, it's very difficult to go back. You've committed yourself to that particular path. So you really have to spend a lot of time in this early stages, in order to really thrash out what it is you're trying to say that's new, even before you really fully understand the literature. So what are the things, people have written about systematic process? What are the things that people talk about here? Well, they talk about the idea that when you actually do the literature review and you actually start to read the literature, you should be free from pre-existing beliefs. So you should be approaching the literature with a blank slate effectively so that you're open to any new ideas. Unlike a narrative review, where you might come in with a particular theoretical idea, in a systematic review, you should try and approach that literature completely open to new ideas, new experiences. So that's quite difficult that's quite problematic to expect that people will do that and that people won't be looking for particular ideas that they already have in mind. But this is a key part of how you do this process. There's key things around inclusion and exclusion criteria. You find in published reviews, for example, uh, journals are excluded when they're not, for example, a 3 or a 4 on the chartered ABS journal list. And again, this is very problematic, when you're excluding papers that might be very important, very influential, but are excluded based on some arbitrary list that you're using. I haven't said that, I'm taking over as co-editor of that list. So, but these lists are there as a guide, so it's important equally to ensure that your literature captures all relevant research and especially books and book chapters that aren't included on that. So again, that's a problematic aspect of it. It's normally the expectation today as well that you look at more than one database. So, for example, you might have EBSCO or Web of Science, and the norm, as shown in the Hebel study, which was also part of that ORM special issue. The Hebel study showed that most reviews today will look at more than one database. And the purpose, the idea there is that databases cover different things, so you want to make sure you really capture all the papers that you're looking at. So then you do your search, your selection, you analyze the papers, and you analyze them by reading them. So you read and assess the papers. The reading, as we'll see later on, is an essential part of the literature review. It's absolutely fundamental. You cannot understand the literature unless you've read the papers. And that it's through the reading that we develop our ideas, our understandings. We learn how to synthesize and integrate the findings. And the interpretation and analysis of the papers happens during the readings. It's not something that happens afterwards. So there are some systematic methods that use pre-given frameworks to analyze the papers, but ultimately reading is an interpretive process. So there's a real word of warning here when you're using GenAI. If you're outsourcing your reading to GenAI, you're not doing a literature review. And I'll come back to this later. The reading is the fundamental part of understanding the literature. We spend, months, even years writing papers that we summarize into 8,000 words. And to outsource that to another agent that summarizes it in one paragraph, you're really missing the richness and the depth of what's in a paper. So, this is a really important point that I'll come back to later. And then the final stage in the systematic literature review is that, there are formats, you very extensive methodology where you outline your search, your selection, your analysis process. But also systematic reviews also follow a format in terms of the findings and how they're presented. So it's typical that there'll be some sort of descriptive analysis where they might, look at the distribution of publications, authors, citations or whatever, and then there'll be some sort of thematic analysis. That thematic analysis will usually be determined by the code or the coding structure that's been identified during the protocol. And then there'll be some discussion at the end. And in fact, in that discussion at the end, authors typically really deviate from those themes in order to develop theory again. So what we find in a systematic literature review is we've got this very strong systematic part in the middle, from the research question right through to the representation of the themes in the paper. And then we have this theory development part right at the start in the development of the protocol, and right at the end in the creative writing and creative synthesis in the discussion. So the kind of the theory part is right at the beginning and the end, and the mechanical systematic part is there in the middle. And I won't have time today, but there could be problematic issues associated with that. I'll touch on in a few minutes, but and systematic methods are very much dominant in the literature today. So what I've presented here is a systematic literature review as a review method. but systematic methods are expected in nearly every published review in the major journals today. So when I say systematic methods, I mean that you are transparent in terms of how you've searched, what keywords you've used, what databases you've looked at, maybe even how you've done the analysis, even though the review may not be a systematic literature review. But definitely systematic elements are the expectation today. So there's a question there in terms of what are the implications of that for theory development? If the dominant, the norm now in publication in business and management is that reviews are systematic, how does that constrain our ability to develop new theory or to introduce techniques and methods that are more innovative? And this is very much a discussion of ongoing research on review methods. So it's typical as well that journals will look for Prisma flowcharts, even if you're doing a narrative analysis, they'll still look for a Prisma that outlines, the number of papers you looked at, the number that you included, excluded. Might even have a Prisma checklist that they might ask for. I should say from experience, some disciplines are stricter on this than others. So HRM, it appears that reviewers really want systematic methods right in there. A review is interpreted as a systematic review. Whereas in other disciplines like, organizational studies, for example, it's much less likely that the reviewers will be insisting on these sort of systematic protocols. So there definitely is a difference between disciplines that I've noticed. But what are the problems with the systematic approach? Well, this is a really interesting piece of research that actually this study here by Greenall and Peacock found that 70% of the articles that were actually cited in the paper were not captured by the systematic search. So there you go. So you've done a systematic review. You've written a lovely discussion at the end in order to develop your theory. But 70% of the papers that you've cited to develop that theory contribution weren't even included in the systematic search to begin with. These were papers that were added later through manual or what's called snowballing. Or it could be that the reviewers have said, what about this, and this paper? So all of a sudden you're just cherry picking these papers and adding them to your review, which kind of throws out the window the whole idea that this is systematic. And I'm not saying this is wrong. I'm just saying, this is problematic. I'm just saying that it's not systematic according to the definition of what a systematic literature review is. But there's an interesting thing. Even a paper that says it followed a systematic literature review process, if you actually look at the papers that are cited in the write-up of that paper at the end, the majority of the papers are not actually those that are captured in the review itself. So snowballing is an important part of developing an understanding of the literature. Snowballing usually develops during the reading of the literature. Hence, as I said, the real importance of reading. And it also occurs during the publication process, during the peer review process. So is snowballing, if it's not systematic, how does that fit in? Snowballing is a part of our understanding of the literature as we integrate our understanding with our reading of the literature. Snowballing is the core part of a narrative review, which I'll talk about in a second, but is very much dismissed within the systematic process. So this is something to bear in mind if you're doing a systematic review, that theory development inevitably involves an iterative process, and you cannot relegate it to the beginning and the end of the stage. It has to happen during the core part of the review, and you have to be flexible to allow this to happen. Then there's some more research. This was by Hebel. Hebel found that different journals have different preferences for even the search strategy and how it's done. So if you think of IJMR, the majority of the searches, as you can see in this chart here, are database driven. So the scholars will say that they've looked at EBSCO or Web of Science or whatever it is. Whereas in the academy journals, the majority of the papers are identified through journal-driven searches. Now, there's an interesting thing. If you think about the academy journals, they privilege the Academy of Management portfolio of journals. And as a result of that, you often find that the so-called systematic reviews in those journals are looking just at AMR, AMJ, Org Science, uh, ASQ, Journal of Management. They're looking at a very small niche club of elite journals that sit at the kind of the top of our field in terms of journal rankings. And again, this can be problematic because then a review really is reinforcing the narratives within those journals rather than the narratives outside. But this is quite an interesting paper that shows that different journals privilege different types of search strategy. Again, are these systematic? Do they capture all the knowledge? Systematic literature review, it's argued that it's an exhaustive search of the literature. How exhaustive is it if you've just looked at 6 journals? And we know how difficult it is to get into those journals. But this is another interesting contribution by Simsek and colleagues, and Simsek found that across all journals, and all types of literature review, there are expectations for systematic methods. So not systematic literature review as a kind of a pure method, but systematic methods. And they outline the different ways in which the papers address this need to be systematic because reviewers are demanding it. Um, it's not only the journals, it's the expectations of the reviewers that a review has to be systematic, or else it's not a review. So what happens if the review isn't systematic? What happens if it doesn't even attempt to be exhaustive? What happens if it doesn't attempt to be objective? Well, this is what the narrative review is. The narrative review is a form of storytelling. It's how literature reviews used to be before the revolution of the Tranfield et al. Paper. When I'm teaching the narrative review, I often use the metaphor of the Irish Shanachie. So the Irish Shanachie is the old storyteller that used to, travel round houses and spread news and information and maybe do a bit of a dance and play the fiddle or whatever. But I had an uncle who was one of these and used to come around when I was a child, I used to see him tell these stories and rhymes and a little bit of Irish thrown in and what have you. And so the Shanachie, what does the Shanachie? They're telling some story. There's some essence of truth there. There's some essence of history and fact, but they're telling it in a way that's entertaining, that presents it in a particular, way through a particular voice. And it's through that they bring that particular event, that particular topic to life. And this is what a narrative review does in a fanciful sense. So a narrative review is analyzing the literature, but they're not going to do it in some so-called, theory-free way. They're actually going to do it through a theoretical lens. They're going to put a theoretical lens or perspective on it right from the very start. They're going to say that I'm looking at this literature from this lens because my purpose is to develop this theoretical view, this theoretical perspective. So it's much more towards a theory paper, but it definitely is a literature review because it is based on the evidence, the literature, or in the storyteller's case, it's based on actual events. It's based on something that's actually happened. So it's an informal method. It is biased and it doesn't claim not to be biased, but it should be still transparent in terms of how that bias has influenced its analysis and how it's influenced its discussion. It's been accused of lacking thoroughness, and as a result of that, you find that most narrative reviews today include systematic elements. So they are clear and transparent in terms of their research question, in terms of how they searched and selected, and in what literature they included. So you find that narrative reviews today have a very strong systematic element, but equally a very, very strong generative element in terms of the theory development. So unlike a systematic literature review, where the theory generation happens at the start, before the search, or right at the end in the paper writing, in the narrative review, the theory development happens throughout the storytelling process. So as you read the literature, as you tell the story, you're developing new interpretations. So the Shanachie, every time that they would tell the story, they would tell it in a new way. They would incorporate new things. They would learn from what's around them. It's almost like a journey. So it's like a journey through a landscape. So the systematic review is building a motorway from one end of the landscape to the other, where you're incorporating all the, you're planning how you're going to build this thing in advance. The narrative review is more of a journey. It's a path. It's an individual journey of discovery as the scholar goes through the landscape. That doesn't mean that it's a journey that you do on your own because you're going to take the audience with you, but you're going to describe the landscape as you do it, as you go through it. And it's through this process that you generate the new theory. So it's almost at the opposite end of the scale from the systematic literature review in terms of being systematic and also in terms of being generative. The generative process come to the fore here. So an integrative review is a review that was really championed by the Academy of Management Annals. So Academy of Management Annals, it started out around the 2011, 2012. And the idea was that they would get very senior people to kind of summarize broad areas of research and to integrate the research, particularly when research had become fragmented. So the purpose here is integration. It's about looking at fields that maybe cross multiple domains. And the idea here is to try and identify similarities and contrasts, to try and identify patterns within the literature. So it's very similar to a narrative review in the sense that it very much depends on the interpretation of the researcher and how that researcher interprets the literature and makes sense of it. But it also is systematic elements because they expect the review to be really extensive, very thorough, and to cover these vast domains, the domains that might be quite different from each other. So it kind of balances the systematic and the generative elements. Um, but generally speaking, again, the central part tends to be systematic, the search, the selection, and the analysis, with the generative parts done at the beginning and the end. So unlike a narrative review, where the search and selection happens hand in hand with the generative theory development part here happens largely at the later stages in the integration, how they bring together the different themes and how they make sense of it. So you typically find in these sorts of papers, and the AMA has lots of them, you find it at the end there's some big integrative framework or some big process model or something that connects all the different literatures. And then they show how that process model is kind of connected to all the first order themes that developed from the analysis. So it's a bit like a kind of a qualitative analysis where some of those qualitative analysis use those templates, those Joya type templates, where you've got this big integrative frame and how it's connected to all the themes that developed from this very complex analysis. And it's a nice metaphor that Matt Cronin and Elizabeth George in the more recent paper they were also the editors recently, and they talk about how if you think about the three journals in the Academy, the AMR, the AMJ, and AMA, the AMR looks at the bricks, the foundations of theory, the bricks of the house. The AMJ looks at the house. This is how all the bricks are connected, to form a particular house, a particular domain. The AMA is about understanding the neighborhoods. It's about how all the houses are connected. It's about integrating all these different parts and theories and domains together. And they talk about this quite interesting idea of zooming in and zooming out as you develop your understanding and your integration. So zooming in to see how the framework connects to a specific idea within a particular theoretical domain, and zooming out to see how they are all connected together. So it's kind of connecting through the different layers of abstraction, and the different and trying to connect across domains. So the meta-analysis is another research method that's very much favored by the Journal of Management. So the Journal of Management, they have an issue, a review issue every year, and they publish lots of meta-analysis, excellent meta-analysis that are really thorough and rigorously complete, carried out. The meta-analysis is a bit like an empirical study. So you come up with a research question, your hypothesis, but you don't gather the data. You look for empirical evidence that's been published. So it's a literature review that focuses on empirical papers with a view to extracting the findings and the outputs from those papers to answer some particular set of hypotheses, to examine some sort of effects. So it's extensive in the sense that you're looking at all published data within this. And I don't know if any of you have had published papers where you've had people, authors of meta-analysis approach you looking for particular correlation tables and stuff. So the key in completing this is you have to have these correlation tables in order to form the raw data to complete the meta-analysis. But the advantage here is that going back to the original ideas of Tranfield et al., you're actually taking stock. You're looking at examining all the evidence on a particular phenomenon or a particular effect at a particular moment in time. And it can be generative, definitely, just like an empirical paper can identify an advanced theory and explore new effects and new aspects of a theory. You can do the exact same with a meta-analysis. So what, looking at all these, what would you say are the strengths and weaknesses of each? And I'll not go into this table in too much depth, but just to summarize, the narrative review, its real strengths are the fact that it looks very much at how you can. It's very theory focused in the sense that you can interpret the literature through a particular theoretical lens and then try and examine the evidence for and support of that particular theoretical arguments from the literature. Its weaknesses are, of course, that it is biased and it isn't as exhaustive as some of the other literature review methods. The systematic literature review, the key advantage here is that it's in theory, it's very transparent and rigorous. But the disadvantage here is during the reading and interpretation of the literature, you're quite limited in terms of how you can reset the research question or reset the actual object, the process and the search terms. So once you commit to a particular research protocol, research questions, you're more or less committed to that until you complete the analysis. So it can be very heavy in terms of resources that are needed and time that's needed. The integrative review, again, is very resource intensive, and editors of these reviews often argue that it's quite difficult to do it as a junior scholar to do an integrative review because to some respect it's unlike a systematic review when you discover the literature. An integrative review, you almost have to have the expertise in advance to determine how to complete the review and what to include. So it can exclude certain types of scholars from doing it. The meta-analysis, the advantage here is that you're gathering all the evidence to look at a particular effect or a particular phenomenon. The disadvantage is you're limited to actually getting the data from those studies. And if there aren't enough studies out there, then you won't really have a meta-analysis. But let's say the final method that I'd want to discuss today is computational methods. So we'll talk in a few minutes about generative AI, but what I want to talk about here is just the kind of the data mining or text mining or the co-citation analysis that can help you in doing literature reviews. So again, there's a nice paper by Anton Sorel that talk about the future of generative AI and computational methods to help you in these processes. And there's lots of papers, an increasing number of papers written on how these different papers can help you through the search in particular, the analysis of the papers also, so even the thematic analysis. And bibliometric analysis, co-citation is one of those. So with the bibliometric analysis, what you do is you're looking at incidents of co-citations. So the papers that are cited within a particular article, um, which papers are cited? Are there any papers that are cited within the same paper? Are there any papers that are cited across papers? And what you can do here is you can develop lots of really nice connectivity maps where you identify how papers and authors and themes are connected across different disciplines. And there's lots of really good packages that are available online that are free as well. VOS viewers, for example, where you can, download, you know, bibliographies or lists of journals. And then you can do all these nice thematic analysis where you identify connections between them. Now, when I was at IGMR, we got quite a lot of bibliometric analysis, and most of them, they produced the charts but didn't do anything more beyond that. Um, and what I would say with bibliometrics is they are really good ways of identifying new clusters, new connections within the literature. So they really should be the starting point for a review analysis or a narrative review or systematic review. They can't be the end in themselves in terms of in terms of trying to publish a literature review. But I would definitely recommend that you all have a go at it because they're very easy to use, and I've done it in a few of the areas that I'm researching, and it's really quite interesting. You identify clusters that aren't apparent or evident, from a general reading. And the big advantage here is it can do an analysis of a vast literature that it just wouldn't be possible to do in a team of scholars. You wouldn't get that level of oversight, to try and identify how the literature is connected in different ways. But as I say, it can be a really good generative tool to help you generate new theory. And I've seen and some of the previous presentations I've done on bibliometrics. Some of these papers are really good. They in IGMR in particular, over the last 5 or 6 years, they've published some really good bibliometrics that identify the clusters and then develop new theory from those clusters. So just as a final few slides, I want to talk about, right, bringing all this back to theory development. What does it mean for theory development? Well, in a paper that Caroline Cottrell and I wrote, again in that special issue in ORM, we differentiate between two types of review paper. There are review papers that fill gaps or that add to an existing knowledge domain. So these are the vast majority of literature reviews that are published fall within this category. So, for example, a miner is, if you think about the metaphor of the miner is someone who extracts the gold or the mineral from the mine, whereas the prospector is the person who goes out to try and find, where the future mines might be. So the miner tends to stick within a disciplinary domain, to work within that domain, to extract mineral in the same way that us as researchers, we will identify a research gap, we'll identify a specific literature, and then we'll try and carve out a literature review that fills a gap that hasn't been filled before. The prospector, on the other hand, maybe works across domains and disciplines. They're looking for new connections. They're looking for new ways of understanding and interpreting the literature. So prospectors is higher risk because we don't know if there's ever going to be gold, in a river or a mountain or a field. Uh, but we look for patterns and and clues within the landscape to try and identify where that future theoretical idea might be. So if we think about the different ways in which one can be a miner or a prospector, so if we think that the uh, the strategies at the top are miner strategies. So, for example, spotting gaps, organizing the literature, problematizing the literature. These are all strategies that are used to try and make sense of literature within a particular discipline, or to fill a gap within the literature in those disciplines. And then the prospector strategies at the bottom, these are more multidisciplinary. So it could be that you're developing theory across domains, or you're merging literatures across domains, or developing metaphors from one domain to another. I'm not going to go into all these strategies here, but I just want you to reflect on the different review methods and how they might be matched to these different broad strategies. So a meta-analysis, for example, is very specific. It spots a specific, it identifies a specific set of hypotheses within a particular domain. It gathers the evidence from that to to fill that gap. So it's very much in the kind of the gap spotting approaches to literature reviews. The systematic literature review equally is about making sense of the literature within a particular discipline. Usually, the outcome here is organizing and categorizing the literature into different themes or problematizing the literature. So, problematizing it according to some set of criteria. So, systematic literature review again is more suited to this minor strategy. The bibliometric analysis could also help you organize the literature in the sense that the cluster maps can help you come up with a new way of identifying themes within the literature, in a kind of a minor strategy. Then as we move down to the prospective range, you find that the narrative review becomes more developed here. So you could, for example, have a narrative review where you're taking a metaphor and you're applying it to literature, or a narrative review where you're taking a theory from one domain and using it in another, or maybe you're combining two literatures together. So you can see that the narrative review is right from the start. It's very theoretically focused. It's presenting the literature through a new lens. And again, this is what the prospector does. And equally, the integrative review could be doing the same. Integrative reviews often blend and merge literatures, but equally, they often identify contradictions in a more of a minor sense. And finally, the bibliometric analysis, as I said, it can definitely help you organize the literature, but that could be the starting point for actually changing your interpretation of the literature, for blending literatures, for merging them together. So you can see that the different review methods are associated with different ways in which you can develop theory within the literature. And if we think about literature reviews, this is an editorial that I wrote with the co-editors at IGMR just as I left in 2022. And we identify four key challenges in writing literature reviews in the future, especially when theorizing from them. The first is the continuing focus on rigor. Given the competition for publication, given the increasingly crowded field, as we've seen at the start, it's important that your review shows that you followed a rigorous method. That applies whether it's a systematic review or a narrative review. The rigor is in the sense that you have been rigorous in how you have searched, how you've analyzed, how you have developed your theory within the review. At the same time, the reviews need to be transparent, whether that is systematic transparency or generative transparency. Generative transparency means you're explaining how you developed the theory, how you analyzed the papers, where your ideas came from. This rigor and transparency underpin the two core elements of systematic methods. Given the increasing numbers of papers that are out there, the scope is going to become increasingly challenging. If you're doing a literature review, so we've completed a literature review recently on GenAI, and there are, dozens of papers being published in business and management every month within this area. And this is increasingly a problematic. The fact that when you're doing a review, the literature is expanding so quickly that the review has difficulty even keeping up with what the state of knowledge is at a particular period of time. So how are you going to deal with this ever expanding field of knowledge when you're doing a review? And the final thing that we argue is going to be the really important part going forward is generativity. Theory development involves a generative process and a creative process in which you create, you're creating new theoretical ideas. Yet in most literature review papers, there are no comments at all on how the theory was developed. There's lots of information given on the systematic processes, but very little given on the generative processes. There are papers, of course, in IJMR recently. I've come across a few papers that are really detailed on the generative aspects, and those papers were actually narrative reviews. But going forward, that this emphasis on rigor and transparency applies not just to the systematic elements, but also to the generative elements. And you'd say, why is this important? Well, it's important because generative AI is playing an increasing hand in papers that are being submitted to journals. Generative AI hides both the systematic and generative processes. They're within the black box of its processing. So it's increasingly important that we can be transparent in those fields. No, as I said, publishing in business and management is the emphasis is overwhelmingly on being systematic in your processes. But theory is not developed principally through systematic elements. It's generated through generative processes. Generative processes are creative processes. How we make connections in what we read, in what we understand in the literature. The differences between completing a mechanical process, like the production of a gear, to creating a painting. A painting is an interpretation of what we see. It's very much our interpretation and how we connect it and what we choose to present. This is a paper that Caroline Gatrell and I are currently working on. So it's important to make that difference. Systematic processes are what's emphasized in business management, but generative processes are also those that underpin the theory development process, and they follow a very different set of rules and processes. So how can generative AI help us in this process? So I'm not going to explore all the ways in which it can help us support the generative side. Generative in the sense of how it can search the literature, how it can summarize the literature, how it can identify themes. There are lots of papers written on that. There are lots of different tools. I would like to present it in a different way. If you think about when we're writing a literature review in a team, you might have three people working together, three review scholars. How do they understand the literature? They understand it through communication. They read some of the papers, they come back, they talk about what they've identified, they talk about the themes, they compare each other's themes, they compare and contrast them, they make some agreement. Okay, these are the themes we're going to go for. And it's this continual iterative process that involves the team making sense of it individually, coming together and agreeing on a way forward. And also that process of interaction is creative because as someone puts forward an idea, it might trigger an idea from another part of the research team, and that can help with the interpretation and the development of theory. So generative AI in most of the literature so far has been talked about as a tool in the same way that I might use a drill to drill a hole in a wall. I might use GenAI to, create a list of all the papers that have been published on this topic, or to summarize all the papers, on this particular field. So you outsource the tool, and it gives you an output that then you interpret and use. But that's not how we work as scholars. We don't say to one of the team, right, you go away, right, you might do this, you go away and do that, and then give us the result, and we'll accept it and won't even challenge it or question it. More than likely, it's an iterative process where you come back, you communicate, and that is how we develop the literature review. We communicate to develop the research question. When we're identifying keywords and reading the literature, it's through communication, negotiation, it's through this creative process of how we're understanding what we should read and how we should read it. And definitely in the creative interpretation of the literature, it involves this interplay, this interaction between the scholars. And I would argue that generative AI's real potential for literature reviews is being a partner in that process, not a tool that we outsource things to, but a partnership where there's a to and fro, there's a give and take, and it works alongside us as we develop the research question. We search and read the literature, and most importantly, when we interpret that literature. We're not outsourcing the reading or the search, and we're definitely not outsourcing the creative interpretation. This is another person who is going to join our research team. This is an alien person. We don't understand how they think, but we will try and understand how they think because we need to make sense of what they're giving us and what we give them. So just this, the final slide, what does this mean in terms of generating theory from literature reviews? And I would say this is regardless of the method that you use. The first is the process of questioning. Questioning is where we identify the research problem, the research question. We identify the gaps, the problems, the phenomena. GenAI is an increasingly powerful tool, Claude, Gemini, ChatGPT, in prompting them to develop these questions. What is an interesting question? Why is that an interesting question? What does Claude or Jenny or Gemini think about that question? What do I think about it, given my response? What is the strengths and weaknesses of this problem? And then discussing this within the wider team. What about the search? The search is where we're trying to identify which literatures, which topics, which theories. Again, ChatGPT, GenAI, Gemini and Claude, these all have varying levels of strengths in the accuracy of the papers that they actually are identifying. But most of them are still at a generic level quite good at identifying the theories of the topics. And so Gen AI is an important role to bounce off ideas to try and identify the directions. And again, the ultimate decisions will be made by the research team, but this is as a research partner. The reading, as I said right at the start, if you're outsourcing your reading to Gen AI, then you're not doing a literature review because through the reading, we understand the literature. Through the reading, we interpret the literature, we make connections, we identify its relevance. But Gen AI can definitely help us here. As we read the literature, we can dialogue with Gen AI to help us in our understanding, help us in the integration of our understanding, help us in making connections, because it's very good at scanning and identifying the utility of or the feasibility of connections. And finally, in the interpretation is where we're making, creative connections between the literature, where we're maybe identifying parts of the literature that compare and contrast with each other, that can help us come up with new theoretical interpretations of that literature. And again, Gen AI is very powerful at using themes and lenses and metaphors to help us interpret. Again, not in a rigorous, systematic way. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about creative generation. It's about bouncing ideas so that we generate more ideas that then we discuss within our research team. Okay, so that's I would love to hear your comments and questions, but that's all I've got here. So thank you.
That's great, Dermot. Thank you so much. I think that was super informative and so many key learnings and key takeaways. So we do have time, quite a few minutes actually for any Q&A. So I can see some coming in the chat, and also if anybody would like to raise their hand to ask any questions or to share any thoughts. So I might jump in, Dermot, to the first one here in the chat, and I can read it out to you. So it's from Stephen. And Stephen is asking, would it be methodologically appropriate to adopt a hybrid approach to your review? So that would be maybe integrating elements of a bibliometric analysis with a systematic literature review.
Yeah, great question, and absolutely, in fact, it's increasingly common now to see multi-stage reviews. So, for example, with bibliometrics, most of the published bibliometric ones that I see that are developed in theory have a bibliometric part and then maybe a narrative or systematic part afterwards. Or maybe they've done a narrative part first and then a bibliometric to try and, identify connections. Um, and I've seen lots of not just bibliometrics, but lots of other connections, in of different types of reviews and how they might be connected. And it's quite interesting that we have a paper under review at the moment, and one of the reviewers we adopted a two-stage approach in our review. We did a very extensive systematic and then followed it with a narrative. And one of the reviewers was saying, you can't do that. You have to have one or the other. And so we, you know, seem to have addressed that issue, but you can see that that the two-stage reviews, provided there's a methodological reason for it, or multi-stage reviews, they definitely can be used together.
Okay, brilliant. So our next question is from Bart, and Bart is asking, to what extent is there a trade-off between being systematic and being generative? And does the minor versus prospector typology that you outlined there risk sort of collapsing those two dimensions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And as I said, Carolyn and I are developing a paper on this. That it's been a few years now in the review process. So these ideas are definitely very important. What we've found in that paper, that research that we're doing, is that actually most review scholars they kind of try to separate systematic and generative parts. Because and the reason for that is because journals are so insistent on review methods being systematic. So what they do is they do the generative part, as I said, right at the start or right at the end, or they don't even report it in the paper. They might have some really interesting insights and themes they've developed, but they don't say anything in the paper about how they develop those ideas and themes. But there are papers that that do discuss this, that do give examples and show how systematic and generative interplayed, almost like a duality as opposed to a dualism. So dualism in the sense that you're separating these, duality in the sense that there's an interplay. And of course there's an interplay. If you're creative, you can't be creative unless you've done the groundwork, the disciplined groundwork, first of all. And if you're coming up with an idea about how to connect two literatures, you just can't do that unless you understand those literatures. But equally, once you have the creative idea, how are you going to sell that to the reader? You have to be, thorough and systematic in terms of how you're presenting it. So there definitely is a trade-off. I would say that minor prospector, all of them, all those strategies that we identify in those in that paper have an element of both systematic and generative. We would say that the kind of the gap spotting papers right at the top that use systematic literature reviews, as I said, the generative parts are very much not ignored, but not reported properly. And in the worst case scenario, they're kind of underexploited. Whereas if you move down towards the prospector end, you typically find in those papers that the scholars are very transparent in terms of how they generated the ideas and how that deviated from the systematic approach that they adopted. That's why in that chart we kind of show a diagonal going down to show that as you move down through the different approaches, the generative elements become more important as you start to, for example, blend literatures together. That involves lots of creative generative steps where you're trying to make the connections between the two different types of literature, the two different disciplines.
Okay, sure. It seems like really good advice and an important distinction. So our next question is, I think, from Amoha. So she says, thank you, Dermot. I am conducting a systematic literature review to bring together different disparate streams of knowledge. And what advice would you have on language unification in that context?
Yeah, so when you're bringing together, it's almost like an integrative review, what you're doing there. But I don't know the extent of it. But you're bringing together different, theoretical domains with different concepts, different language, different, assumptions and backgrounds. And I think and that's why most people don't do that. They stay within the particular discipline. Because inevitably, when your paper goes out to review, you're probably going to get reviewers from those different domains that will be defensive to some extent of their theoretical approach, their interpretation of that particular phenomenon. So I would, if you think about the world of practice is multidisciplinary. but the world of research, we have carved out these different, you know, disciplinary schools that we work within. And when you're trying to bridge these, it can become tricky and problematic. So the really important part of your paper is to try and integrate, to try and reach some sort of compromise between how the reviewers from those different disciplines might interpret what you're doing. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying these, you know, the papers that you're trying to do are, you know, from different disciplines are extremely difficult to get published. It's, you know, especially when you're trying to develop a theory, because the reason often the theoretical position of one discipline is it's only there because it's kind of juxtaposed against the theoretical approach of another. So if you're coming in and you're trying to merge them together, when their whole existence is the fact that they're separate and they're competing, it does make it very different, very difficult. You know, what I would suggest in those, there are some nice review papers that compare and contrast. So they don't attempt to blend and to bring together or to integrate. What they're doing is they're comparing and contrasting. So they're saying these are the parts that are similar and these are the parts that are different. Actually, GenAI is very good at doing that. If you can go in and give it to, provided you're very specific on the specific theories or papers that you're talking about, you can ask it to compare and contrast. And the good thing about GenAI is that it'll do it using the patterns and interpretations from all the other disciplines. So it can really give you a higher, that kind of zooming out, you know, that zooming out point of view that can be very useful.
Okay, sure. So maybe on a related note then, Dermot, the next question from Claire. So you touched on various tools there during your presentation that you might use as part of reviews. Are there any in particular that you would value the most or might recommend?
In terms of tools to help you be systematic, I wouldn't make any comment because I don't use them myself, but I know that colleagues that do use them. I prefer to actually read the papers and use post-its. And my wall here is covered in post-its and all. I'm still old school in that regard, but certainly Gen AI tools are very, very useful. You know, they are very useful as a you know, like a critical friend where you bounce ideas off. There's an idea I'm developing with another group of colleagues here on you know, the way I like to think about Gen AI is like a drunk professor. It's like this very knowledgeable person with lots of experience, uh, but maybe, you know, isn't as constrained or disciplined in terms of what they're throwing back at you. And maybe what they're saying doesn't make sense either. It's a bit nonsense. But still great to have a conversation with them and great for generating ideas and great for bouncing ideas off. But would I get them to pick the kids up from school or something like that? No, I probably wouldn't. But would I get them to have a chat about picking kids up? Absolutely, I would. So that's so going back to the reading of the literature. Don't get the drunk professor to read the literature for you, but definitely read it and have a conversation with them in the pub afterwards about it, because your interpretation of that literature may change. So I am using it more and more for that, but definitely not to outsource writing or to get it to rewrite. Because again, when it rewrites, it's what I found as an editor is I can tell when there's an inconsistency in the narrative of a paper. And what's really important is your voice and your narrative comes out in the paper. And the problem with Gen AI is that there'll be multiple voices and narratives there. And you know, so it's difficult to have that kind of that consistent theme because it's drawn from so much and depending on what prompt you give, it'll go off in a different direction or whatever. But definitely as a creative tool, it is fantastic. It's just as good as the post-its.
Sure. Okay. So proceed with caution, I guess, is
Yeah.
the advice. So our next question is from Jer. A really good question, I think. So can you conduct a systematic review as a lone PhD researcher, or would that be something else?
Yeah, that's a good one. You can definitely write a literature review as a lone PhD, and IJMR, we used to publish a lot of literature reviews by PhD lone scholars. Uh, the problem with you can do a review with systematic elements as a lone PhD scholar, doing a systematic literature review, which today usually is a very extensive piece of work given the amount of literature out there. It typically involves, you scanning through hundreds of papers and then analyzing them. And the problem as a PhD student is you're discovering the literature, you're developing your understanding of it. And the systematic literature review forces you to commit to a certain path before you've even understood the literature. So I wouldn't recommend it. I had a PhD student, I have a PhD student in France, and we had this discussion about whether he should do this systematic literature review. And we decided that that's, that the understanding of the literature happens as you're reading. So systematic, yes, definitely. But systematic literature review, it's best done by a team that are already quite familiar with the literature, that are already probably read a good chunk of the literature, and that what they're trying to do is take stock of everything else, so that hopefully your interpretations, your understanding of the knowledge isn't going to change that much during the reading. Because the problem is that if it does change dramatically, you can't go back and start it all over again. And if you do, you've wasted a lot of time. Well, not wasted because you've still read something, but wasted in the sense of completing that specific SLR project. So I would suggest to you that to continue doing the review on your own, if that's what you want to do, and make sure you have systematic elements, but just don't call it a systematic literature review. And I should say this, I would recommend anyone, unless you have done a pure systematic review, don't bring the word systematic into the paper. When you submit it to a journal, don't use the word systematic because it's very problematic. Some reviewers interpret it very differently and often misinterpret what an SLR or systematic means. You don't have to say systematic. You just have to say we've used rigorous, transparent methods. And I would really avoid you saying that the review is replicable, because in my view, nothing is replicable when it comes to publishing. And I've seen papers that have said this is a replicable literature review, and you know that it isn't, because even if we had followed the same process, come up with the same interpretations, we're not going to use the same 8,000 words to represent it. And those 8,000 words are such an important part of presenting your understanding. So I would definitely not use the word replicable, and I would advise against even using the word systematic, but to definitely include the rigorous and transparent methods that we've talked about.
Sure. Okay. So we've loads of questions still coming in, Dermot. So we'll get around to as many as we can. So I think it's Ashima has a question again on maybe Gen AI and maybe from your experience as an editor. To what extent are journals open to accepting the strategy of sort of having Gen AI as a partner or using it as part of your review?
That's a great question. And at the AOM in Copenhagen, I was with a big bunch of editors, and we did this thing on Gen AI in literature reviews. And the kind of consensus view at the moment is that most journals are very against this. They're very against using. What's quite interesting, and this is a bit hypocritical actually of journals, is that a lot of them say we don't want you to use Gen AI for copy editing. So I remember there was an editor of a few months ago, an editor of a very high-ranking journal, give this presentation and said, we don't want you to use Gen AI for copy editing. And then afterwards, I was having a cup of coffee with them, and or tea in my case, and I said, so do you allow the editors to use copy editors to rewrite their papers? And he said, oh, absolutely, yes. I said, do they have to disclose that they've used copy editors? No, 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 they don't. These copy editors are professionals. And then I said, right, so if you're a scholar who doesn't have access to a copy editor, English is not your first language, um, you're discriminated against those colleagues because GenAI is the only way that they're going to be able to rewrite this thing in professional English. So but if they had enough money, they could get a very professional copy editor to rewrite the entire paper. And I've worked outside, outside the UK and Ireland, and I've seen some scholars' papers being completely transformed after copy editing, turned into beautiful, beautiful papers. So you're basically discriminating against someone who's using ChatGPT as opposed to using a copy editor because they haven't got the resources. And I think this is the general view, the general kind of Luddistic view of editors that Gen AI should not be used at all in any of the paper writing. And the problem is if you say that they don't want you to use it, and yet they want you to disclose your use, the only thing that's going to happen there is people aren't going to disclose it. They're not going to disclose it because they know it might lead to an instant rejection. So I think, editors and journals need a very, very different approach to this. They need to accept the fact that AI sure is used as a tool, but it can also be used as a partner, just as you're saying, and as we've discussed. And what is wrong with that? What is wrong with Gen AI, you creating an idea through an interaction with Gen AI? If you might create an idea through a conversation with someone in the pub, and do you put that in the paper? Do you say that, I was chatting to my uncle in the pub and he came up with this great idea about this metaphor and I decided to use it. And then the editor's going to say, right, your paper's rejected because that's not your idea. Of course, they're not going to say that. So why would they say it against Gen AI? So we need a very different approach as editors in terms of the advice that we're given on the use of Gen AI. As I said, in literature reviews, I would be against the use of Gen AI for reading and synthesizing papers, but definitely not for as part of the review process and how that review has been carried out, provided, of course, that the authors are fully disclose this. Of course, the counter argument that I was at a thing the other night with editors, and the argument is that lots of people now are actually writing reviews totally using Gen AI, and they're overwhelming the submissions of a lot of journals. So you have submissions of journals doubling in the last couple of years. So how do you deal with that problem? And journals are dealing with it by saying you're not allowed to use Gen AI, but then no one discloses it, and they're continuing to use it, and numbers are still. So sorry to really go on round about gone round and round with this one, but what I would say is that the journal editors need a different approach to disclosure. They need to encourage people to disclose how they're using Gen AI, and that disclosure is not it's not different from all the ways in which we've been writing papers in the past, the way we've been using copy editors, the way we've been bouncing ideas off people, the way we've been getting ideas at conferences, the way people have been stealing ideas from others as well. Let's not forget and that's something that's not really talked about, how peer reviewers read a paper, take the idea, and then write something on it. All these things need to be part of the process. All this disclosure needs to be much more open. And Gen AI, I think, is the catalyst for that. It's going to force us to have a very different approach to disclosure. It's unrealistic to think that people aren't going to use this tool that can revolutionize knowledge production. It's unrealistic, and I don't think it's the right approach anyway. So we need a different mindset. We need a different, completely different outlook. But just to be a bit more pragmatic, I would always check with the editor of the journal what their approach is, just to make sure that you're not going to get a paper instantly rejected. But equally, as an editor, I would always encourage you to be fully transparent in your disclosure, because eventually, if the paper's published, eventually, there'll be tools in the future that will find out whether it has been used or not.
Sure. Okay. So Anna has a question on the types of reviews that you mentioned in your presentation. So is there a particular type or style of review that you would expect to find in a thesis monograph?
So in a thesis, presuming that you're going to try and get some papers published out of a monograph, the review, you would expect these systematic elements, the keywords, the research question, the databases, have you done a thorough analysis? I would definitely say to be transparent in how you've done the snowballing. So how you've added additional papers. Why have you added them? Usually these are generative reasons why you're adding them. So you might read the paper, and then it references some other paper that looks really interesting, that maybe is a bit off topic, and you decide to read that paper as well. I would, and in your PhD, I would try and audit and keep an audit trail of all these things while you've done them, because it's good for you to understand how this happened. But I would say in the coming years, journals will be asking for you to explain why, how you came up with the ideas. Actually, in that paper, the minor prospector one that Caroline and I published, one of the reviewers asked us where we got the idea. So some reviewers are already asking. I got the idea from having a chat with some bloke in America. So, and then I mentioned, that this was, who this scholar was. And so it's important to be transparent and to be totally and open and transparent, because people can learn from your approach as well. How have you come up with that idea? Is there an interesting method that you've used? Even, it might have been just luck or, a chance encounter or whatever, but it shows that this is a process that other people then can be open to, that can help them, follow similar generative paths. So that's what I'd recommend, that you should have clear systematic, you should document the systematic parts, but also document where your ideas came from and why, for example, you might have changed direction of your 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 literature review or the research that you're doing. And I would put that in the methods chapter of your thesis.
Okay, all right. So we're almost out of time, so I'll try and run through a few more as quickly as we can. So Esther is asking, is it acceptable to clearly state that some papers were manually added to your review because they did not come up in the database search? And is that okay?
Absolutely. So as we've seen that paper by, was it Simsek and colleagues, they found that, no, it was by Grinnell and Peacock, they found uh, that the majority of reviews, they cite papers that weren't included in the systematic search. So the only thing I would say is that you're clear about why you did include them. Now, it could be that when you're in the peer review process, you've got some reviewer that said, I want you to include these papers. Um, and you might think, right, I have to include them in order to keep this reviewer happy. You don't have to do that. You should read the papers definitely, but then decide yourself whether they are relevant to include. I wouldn't just include them because someone has asked you to do that. Because what can happen then is that the paper can look awkward, because you've included things that maybe are the pet topic, or maybe even the papers of the reviewer themselves, which is unethical if they're doing that. That then have distorted your narrative and pulled it out of sync or whatever. But usually I find that the majority of papers that peer reviewers recommend, they're there for a reason, and they can actually give you some nice new insights or new things to develop within the paper. So definitely document why you haven't included certain papers in the manual search. And of course, the search won't capture everything, because a paper may be labeled as something else, but actually talk about the thing that you're interested in. So keywords, are really fairly limited in terms of picking up the papers that are actually very relevant for your review.
Sure. Okay. So maybe as a final question, Dermot, I'm sort of maybe combining a few people's questions here, but prompted by Josephine, who talks about the need for an integrative review in her research area. But she highlights that she's a junior scholar, a well-experienced practitioner, but a junior scholar. And even though this might be the next step in the field, Josephine asks if they might be on a fool's errand due to being maybe early career or a junior scholar. And some other questions or people in the chat were asking about if there are particular journals that are more open to reviews from early career researchers.
Yeah, so I would say that all journals, in theory, are open to early career papers. Uh, as I said, IJMR definitely. We published quite a few papers by early career. In fact, the first paper I got published during the PhD was an IJMR, and that was a paper, a literature review. But what I would say is that as an early career researcher, you have the fresh insight and the fresh ideas that academics that have been in the field don't have. So definitely do not give up on the project. Sure, it can be more difficult to get published, especially if you're trying to do it on your own. But but keep at it and keep learning from the peer review experience. Peer review, it's a great thing, and long may it continue because it's free, and you'll get expert, feedback from the leading people in the field. So please do keep at it and definitely don't give up. And of course, you'll have other projects that you'll add to it as you're moving along. But especially if it's close to your heart and you have a passion for it and you really think it's a good idea, and especially if other people are telling you that's a great idea, never ever give up on it. It can take you a while to get these things published. I've got a few papers that it's over 10 years that I'm still in the peer review with. These things can take time, and they mature over time and they get better in theory. But definitely don't give up on it, and keep at it, because you'll get some editor that will like it and that will work with you to get it published if it still needs lots of development.
Sure. Okay. Okay. I think it's a really nice optimistic note for us to head towards the end of our discussion on. So Dharma, thank you once again for all your time and for answering so many of our questions. I'll pass back over to Claire.
Dermot, thank you so much. You got all the questions imaginable there, and there was definitely more coming in. So we thoroughly appreciate your time. I learned a load, and I definitely could spend a half an hour with you asking more questions. Thanks to everybody for all the questions. Just very briefly for everybody, while I have your attention here, just to give you a heads up on a few further events that the IAM ECDN hosts. So we have some virtual PhD writers retreats coming up. So if you keep an eye on our page on the Irish Academy of Management webpage and the ECDN tab, you will see details of all those events. We have a LinkedIn page as well, which you can follow. So we have 2 virtual PhD writers retreats coming up, and we also are hosting a workshop at the Irish Academy of Management conference, which will be in the University of Limerick during the doctoral colloquium on August 24th. And that workshop will focus on my PhD and AI. And then we have been very fortunate that we have obtained funding to host an in-person writers retreat for Irish Academy of Management Early Career Development Network members. This will be a competitive process, so we're currently organising that. So more details on that to follow. I sent in the chat the details, the link, in order for you to give us some feedback on today's session. So I'd be very grateful if you were to scan the QR code or click the link, which the QR code is on your screens now, and all feedback welcome. There's also a question at that QR code about future events or activities that you would like us to host. And then last but not least, if you are an early career researcher, you might be a seasoned academic, but an early career researcher working on your PhD, or if you're an early career academic, or if you are most especially a PhD student. If you scan the QR code there, you will be able to join our LinkedIn group of early career academics so that we can keep in touch with you and so that you can build a network of your own and keep in touch with each other. So that is everything from us this morning. Thanks everyone for attending and for all your questions. And most especially, again, Dermot, if I haven't said it enough, I'll say it again. Thank you so much for your time and for all your knowledge, both personal and professional. I am very happy to hear that you do have a work in progress that's taking 10 years. That makes me feel a little bit better about some of the things I've been sitting on. So really appreciate your honesty, and I'm sure everyone in the room does as well. And a lot of the comments coming in here, Dermot, I don't know if you've spotted them as they're coming, but some of the comments and the feedback already coming in are gratitude for the specificity and pragmatism in your content and your answers. So clearly that's very appreciated. So that's it, everyone. Thank you very much, and hopefully see some of you at the next event.